Multiple British leaders have famously declared that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Beyond being a catchy phrase, the sentiment was once true. At its height, the British Empire ruled over 400 million people, roughly 1 in every 4 inhabitants of Earth at the time. With such immense power came immense responsibility. And while many former British colonies rank among the most successful nations today, that success often followed bloody struggles to overthrow their colonial rulers. The English people of the time didn't see themselves as the bad guys. They viewed their conquests as civilizing missions, efforts meant to advance the societies they dominated. That these missions also enriched the homeland was, in their minds, a fortunate side effect. The New Yorker writes, "In the 20th century's hierarchy of state-sponsored violence, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and Hirohito's Japan typically take top spots. The actions of a few European empires have invited harsh scrutiny too. Belgium's conduct in Congo, France's in Algeria, and Portugal's in Angola and Mozambique. Britain is rarely seen as one of the worst offenders, thanks to a lingering reputation for decency, an image that Harvard historian Caroline Elkins has spent over 2 decades working to dismantle. Her New History of the British Empire, Legacy of Violence, brings crucial context to the individual stories of that time. Drawing from archives in a dozen countries across 4 continents, examining hundreds of oral histories, and building on the work of social historians and political theorists, Elkins traces the empire's trajectory across centuries and crises. As the only imperial power to remain a liberal democracy throughout the 20th century, Britain claimed moral distinction from other European colonial powers. It presented itself as a force for rule of law, enlightened governance, and social progress. But Elkins argues that Britain's systematic use of violence was no better than that of its imperial rivals, only more skillfully concealed. Elkins, whose work is central to understanding the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, argues that the British Empire endured for over 200 years because its model of state violence was cloaked in the velvet glove of liberal reform. History, as the saying goes, is written by the victors, and in Britain's case, it was eloquently penned by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. But any student of history knows the trail of violence left by British rule. The American Revolution, Gandhi's mostly peaceful resistance during World War II, Nelson Mandela's armed struggle against apartheid, and the centuries of bloody entanglement in Irish history. Each stands as an example of the sun finally setting on British dominance. Today, history is no longer the exclusive domain of the victors. Revisionist scholars are unearthing and telling the stories of rebels whose causes were long buried with them. The re-examination of Britain's imperial legacy is long overdue, and it raises a compelling question. What of the other empires whose atrocities are often treated as footnotes in comparison? The Spanish Empire, for instance, is ripe for such scrutiny. Its failures in governance were frequently disguised beneath the pious veneer of spreading Catholicism to what they viewed as the primitive peoples of the world. As one of Europe's 2 dominant seafaring powers, Spain often served as the first point of contact between indigenous populations and the Western world. But instead of building effective institutions, the Spanish proved themselves dogmatically ill-equipped to uplift those they subjugated. This was especially true in the case of the Philippines. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the relationship between the United States and its first colony, the Philippines. Episode number 1, Magellan's Legacy. Ferdinand Magellan discovered the Philippines while circumnavigating the globe, seeking to establish a westward route to the famed Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, an effort that would allow Spain to compete with its rival Portugal. His discovery was serendipitous. Under the terms of his mission, Magellan was entitled to claim the profits from 2 of the islands, after the king had selected 6 for himself. The Moluccas were already under Portuguese control and thus off limits, but the Philippines, with its more than 7,500 islands, offered a seemingly endless opportunity for wealth and expansion. In the introduction, I used the offensive term primitives, a reflection not of my own view, but of how Magellan and many of his contemporaries perceived non-Europeans. On March 18, 1521, when he first encountered Filipinos, Magellan expected to meet savages. Instead, he found a sophisticated society deeply connected to the Eastern world through centuries of trade. Arab and Chinese merchants had visited the islands regularly throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, continuing the ancient non-high trade routes dating back to the 9th century. Bhutan Island, Magellan's landing site, was a major port in this network. As such, the arrival of foreign ships didn't shock the locals. They were well accustomed to strangers arriving in search of trade. Magellan's first major misstep was in assuming that the local chief he met held dominion over more than just a small portion of one island in the archipelago that now constitutes the world's 11th largest island nation. Like many European explorers of the era, Magellan was driven by the 3 G's: gold, glory, and God. He quickly turned his attention to religious conversion, organizing a baptism ceremony and promising his new allies eternal rewards in exchange for their faith. In Christianity, particularly its universalizing branches, baptizing someone mere days after they've heard of the religion isn't unusual. Many traditions baptize infants and later instill the tenets of the faith over time. According to historian John Leedy Phelan, it was not until his arrival in the Philippines that the religious sentiments of Magellan's nature began to assert themselves with vehemence and ardor. On Easter Sunday, Magellan and his men celebrated Mass and baptized 500 of the chief's warriors. Then they ordered the destruction of local religious idols. Magellan left behind a cross on the beach, and according to legend, it is still the original that stands today. It symbolizes the enduring Christian faith in the region and the ease with which Magellan initially gained converts. But Christianity was not the only faith vying for influence in the islands. Islam and Buddhism had already gained footholds among various tribes. The Philippines were far from a united people. Historian Stanley Carnow describes the situation this way. Feuds were chronic, often interminable. Villages went to war over real or imagined insults, to capture slaves or to abduct women, to resolve water disputes or rival claims to rice fields. Without the arbitration of a higher authority like the impartial magistrate that functioned at the time in China, conflicts were seldom adjudicated. The winners would impose their will on the losers, who awaited the chance for revenge, and the vendettas could drag on for generations. Magellan's second and final mistake was allowing himself to be drawn into one such feud with a local tribe led by Lapu-Lapu. A full recounting of that conflict can be found in our Season 4 series on Magellan's life. For now, suffice it to say that Magellan left the safety of his ships to confront his Christian allies' tribal rival, hoping to demonstrate Spanish superiority and divine favor. But his hubris delayed the battle long enough for Lapu-Lapu's forces to mobilize. The resulting skirmish overwhelmed Magellan. He sustained multiple wounds and was ultimately killed. Meanwhile, most of his men remained on the ships, out of range and out of action. To this day, it's unclear whether their hesitation was due to confidence in their commander or a silent mutiny, one that could easily be denied afterwards. You survived. You clearly didn't need us. Emma Jackson of Liberty University notes, much of the Western world remembers Magellan as the first man to circumnavigate the globe, not as the man who was killed by natives in the Philippines. In contrast, the Battle of Mactan remains embedded in the Philippine national consciousness. Lapu-Lapu acted as a defender of his people against foreign invaders. Historian Ronaldo C. Ileto adds, Lapu-Lapu is a national hero, and his victory over Magellan is extolled as a typical example of prehistoric Philippine martial prowess. So much so that Lapu-Lapu was honored with a national holiday. In the legislative note accompanying the holiday's creation, he is declared the first successful defender of the Philippine shores, the first national hero to resist and repel Spanish invaders, driving them back into the sea. Sebastian del Cano successfully completed the first circumnavigation of the globe, bringing back maps that validated Magellan's claim of the Philippines for Spain. King Philip II, after whom the islands are named, dispatched several expeditions to turn that cartographic claim into something more tangible. 3 years after the return of the Trinidad, explorer Garcia Joffre de Locia was sent to colonize the islands, locate a missing ship from Magellan's fleet, and search for the mythical isles from which King Solomon supposedly mined precious metals. He failed on all 3 counts. His fleet scattered during the Pacific crossing, and only 25 of the original 450 would-be conquerors reached the Philippines. Far too few to launch a colonization effort. The following year, Venetian explorer Sebastian Cabot was sent to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Philippines lay within Spain's legal sphere of influence. But Cabot abandoned the mission, diverted by rumors of Incan wealth, and was ultimately stranded in Brazil. In 1528, Alvaro de Saavedra managed to land in the Philippines. Sent by Hernan Cortez ostensibly to recover Locia's missing fleet, the explorer's true mission was to acquire enough spices to allow Cortez a comfortable retirement. Remarkably, some of the original Spanish survivors had established a foothold in the islands, but their success was short-lived. They were soon drawn into conflict with the Portuguese on one of the more productive spice islands and ended up as prisoners. After 5 years in captivity, only 8 men returned to Spain. Having repeatedly failed to recreate the magic of Magellan's voyage, Spain entered a decade-long lull, continuing to send sailors to their doom. One such figure, Roy López de Villalobos, bestowed the name Las Islas Filipinas on the archipelago. He died of disease in a Portuguese prison. However, the maps he created helped reinforce Magellan's claim that the islands belonged to Spain. These documents also fueled the misconception that the Philippines were a homogeneous entity, rather than a collection of distant kingdoms and cultures. When Philip II ascended to the throne, he inherited not just his father's empire, but also his fixation with Pacific expansion. Carnau explains, the Portuguese were profiting handsomely. They had monopoly on commerce with China from their base at Macau, and were even dealing with Japan, a forbidden land to foreigners. Spanish officials in Mexico, who saw trade with Asia as a boon to their own interests, advised Philip that Spain's presence in the Philippines would subvert Portuguese ambitions in the region. After some hesitation, Philip ordered his viceroy in Mexico to prepare yet another Pacific expedition. Thus began a 300-year period in which Spanish authorities in Mexico would govern the Philippines as an imperial subsidiary, essentially a colony of a colony. Miguel Lopez Legazpi, a grandfather in his 50s, was selected to finally subjugate the local population. Spanish authorities doubted Mexico's choice, assuming that Legazpi suffered from advanced senility. But age brought experience, and Legazpi quickly grasped the fragmented nature of the island chain. He employed a strategy of divide and conquer, noting that they have no leaders and are so divided among themselves that they can never join together in a demonstration of strength. If you read anything about the colonization of the Philippines, you'll likely come across one reoccurring phrase, that the conquest was, quote, relatively bloodless. But that characterization speaks more to the Spanish experience than to that of the locals. Legazpi was not shy about using violence when it suited his goals. He also left behind an extensive paper trail, letters to the king that survive to this day, through which we understand how his perspective shaped the narrative of a benign takeover. Historian Jose Pascal challenges the idea of a gentle conquest, writing, "The conquest of the Philippines greatly impacted the indigenous peoples of the island chain. Spanish hegemony altered the land's existing social, economic, and political structures. Warfare and slavery expanded under Spanish rule, while women and transgender men lost power within the newly constructed Philippine society. Warfare, already endemic to the islands, resembled what scholars now call a fiscal military state, where elite leaders initiated conflicts to extract human resources and maintain dominance over their rivals." Legazpi quickly subdued Manila and made it the center of the Spanish rule. Adopting a strategy of pragmatic alliance, the indigenous Pampango eventually sided with the Spanish after suffering a series of defeats. As Pascal notes, the Pampangan soldiers were vital in annexing the territory to the Spanish dominion. Their familiarity with the terrain, access to food stores, and sheer manpower made the conquest feasible. One Spanish captain general reported, "Under each captain was a troop of 20 Spanish soldiers and 500 or 600 Indians, Pampango, who were willing to go to war and gave much assistance because of the damages received by them from a rival tribe." Rather than launching a sweeping systemic conquest, the Spanish carved out a limited area of control centered around Manila. They joined a vast and diverse network of local peoples, languages, and faiths, but their influence ultimately dominated thanks to the introduction of 3 key colonial mechanisms. The first was the encomida system, a Spanish institution imported from Mexico. This system imposed a feudal-style landholding in a region that had never embraced the idea of land ownership. Land titles were handed out to loyalists who had proven themselves during the conquest. The competition for spoils often led to atrocities designed to gain favor with higher authorities. By the 1540s, the Spanish crown began distancing itself from the system. But the vast distance between Madrid and Manila ensured that the practice endured for centuries. Historian Eric Anderson explains, to a great extent, the resilience of encomienda in the Philippines was due to the frontier nature of the colony. Because the Philippines was a tenuous foothold in the east in the face of Dutch, English, Muslim, Malay, and Chinese assaults, successive Spanish kings allowed encomiendas to survive as valuable and inexpensive tools of Iberian imperialism. Suddenly, the Filipino people, men and women who had previously focused their economic activities on fulfilling basic needs, were forced to pay tribute simply to remain on land their families had lived on for generations. Having done the hard work of conquering the islands, the conquistadors expected to grow fat off the labor of others. The early abuses inflicted on indigenous communities can be directly traced to the demands of the encomienda system. Though designed to provide 1/3 of collective revenue to the Spanish crown, Madrid never saw much profit. Anderson notes, royal tribute revenues from the Philippines were a mere pittance compared to expenditures, and could never be compared to the value of silver shipments from the Americas. The colony was never a paying proposition. A subsidy or situado from the colonial government of New Spain was annually remitted to the Philippines to keep it operating. So why maintain a system they knew was abusive, especially when it wasn't producing revenue? To the Spanish crown, encomienda was more than an economic instrument. It was a tool for, quote, civilizing the Filipino people, in exchange for allowing them to live on what was suddenly declared Spanish land and taxing them in the form of chickens, rice, or other goods. The Spanish encomiendos claimed that they were offering religious instruction, security from external threats, and practical life skills. But a cynic might note, the land already belonged to the Filipino people. Their traditional religions were being violently suppressed, and Spaniards themselves were the external threat, and the so-called soft skills were irrelevant to a way of life that had functioned for centuries without them. The second concept introduced by the Spanish was the repartimiento system. In addition to taxes levied through encomienda, the colonial government needed labor to build the infrastructure that would expand and consolidate Spanish rule. Large brigades, sometimes 7,000 to 8,000 men, were conscripted to build roads, transport timber, or construct ships. These laborers were poorly fed, paid almost nothing, and routinely flogged for failing to meet work quotas imposed by colonial middle managers. In 1620, a concerned Franciscan friar wrote to the king, warning that locals were being enslaved, exhausted, and killed, rather than being encouraged to love Spain and to attend better to the worship of God. Because the system relied on traditional Filipino chiefs to distribute labor quotas, it embedded corruption into the colonial structure. Pampangan officials routinely enriched themselves by tacking on extra demands, exempting their friends and relatives, and accepting bribes in exchange for leniency. But the most significant Spanish import was the rise of the monastic orders. Medieval Spain was deeply and dogmatically Catholic. The ferocity of the Spanish Inquisition ensured that the Protestant Reformation never gained a foothold within its borders. Under Philip II, Spain embraced its role as the defender of Catholicism, waging ideological and military battles with the Netherlands, France, and England. These European conflicts drained not only Spain's coffers, but also its attention from its colonial projects, particularly the Philippines. In the crown's absence, religious orders stepped into the power vacuum and became the dominant force in the islands. Carnot explains, by the early 17th century, 5 religious orders had each carved out its distinct sphere of influence. In theory, the natives were to rule themselves under Spain's guidance, but the friars ran the show. Their despotism is absolute, lamented an 18th century Manila official. They command these islands, governing at their own will. They derived their power from the enormous influence of the monastic orders, independent institutions worldwide in scope, much like present-day multinational corporations. Secular officials came and went, but the clergy stayed. Over a 25-year period in the 19th century, 16 Spanish governors served in Manila, compared to only 2 archbishops. With silver flowing into Madrid from the New World, Spain could afford to absorb the economic losses of this far-flung colony. The friars and monks were enthusiastic participants in the civilizing mission, and should they succeed, the Spanish monarchy envisioned a domino effect. Converting the Philippines would serve as a launch pad for the Christianization of all of Asia. In the case of the Philippines, God ultimately triumphed over both gold and glory as the enduring justification for 3 centuries of Spanish subjugation. Try as they might, the monastic orders never fully accomplished their assigned task. Despite their efforts, the Spanish failed both to dislodge Islamic influence and to eradicate the traditional belief systems of the island's residents. As Carnot explains, the friars, realizing that however much zeal they might display in church, the natives had not forsaken their ancient beliefs, accommodated to a syncretic compound of Catholic doctrine and animistic practices. In some places, they baptized babies with pig blood, and nearly everywhere they blessed fields during planting and harvesting seasons to coincide with native rites that were associated with the spirits of nature. The Spanish unified the island under the crown and religion, but failed to eliminate its tribal texture. Historian James Goodnow adds that Spanish colonials built a church on a foundation of native religions that worshipped a plethora of gods, goddesses, and demigods. The Spanish did not obliterate these earlier religions, but brought in a more powerful god. In many ways, this represented a failure of the Spanish civilizing mission. According to the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Nonviolence Project, the bishops were convinced that the laws of the Indios, if they had any, were from the devil, the father of lies. The Spanish believed they had a sacred duty to eliminate all presences of the devil, viewing the indigenous belief system as a palpable manifestation of Satan's presence. They justified their harsh actions with the belief that they were saving the souls of the Filipinos they were conquering. The result is a country that remains one of the most fervently Catholic nations in the world, but one whose Catholicism doesn't always mirror the traditions of its European siblings. In the Philippines, Catholic belief has been shaped by enduring indigenous traditions. Ancestor veneration is still common, and many Filipinos believe the spirits of the dead directly influence the living. This belief system has evolved into a widespread devotion of Catholic saints throughout the islands, despite the First Commandment's insistence on worshiping only one God. These pagan practices vary widely from parish to parish, giving rise to what scholars call folk Catholicism. As the Nonviolence Project notes, folk Catholicism is more than just a religion. It represents an active attempt by a group of people being subjugated to fight back against the colonial pressures imposed on them at all times. It also represented dissatisfaction with the institution of Christianity as a whole. The Filipino people adapted Catholicism to fit their needs, completely disregarding some aspects, while resisting the religious uniformity imposed by the Spanish colonizers. One part of Catholic tradition that did take deep root was the Passion of the Christ. To this day, one resident of the island of San Antonio reenacts the crucifixion each Easter, having nails driven into his hands and feet in order to be raised up on the cross. He's done this 35 times. If that's not religious fervor, I don't know what is. Carr now explains the broader appeal of this ritual. The Passion of Christ spread among rural folks until the friars, perceiving its potentially seditious message, sought in vain to stop its circulation. Peasants, poor and humiliated, identified their plight with Christ's ordeal, convinced that by emulating him they could transform their misery into salvation, their darkness into light, their ignorance into knowledge, their dishonor into purity, their despair into hope. This idea is vital not only to the remainder of this episode, but also to the ones that follow. The desire to follow in the footsteps of a man who rose only through suffering and death on the cross manifested itself politically as well. Carr now continues. In their desperate quest for salvation, they recurrently rallied around dissident leaders who, imitating Christ, promised redemption. The history of the Philippines from the Spanish era through the American colonial period and on into the present has been punctuated by revolts triggered by messianic figures claiming to be divinely guided. Efforts to control and reshape the local population continued unabated throughout the next century. The Spanish amassed wealth through the galleon trade, with the Philippines serving as a middleman between China and Mexico. At this time, China had closed its ports to foreign merchants, but the Filipino people had centuries' worth of prized Chinese goods sitting in their homes. Spanish rulers collected Celadon bowls from the Song dynasty and Ming porcelains from the public and sold them for high prices in the Americas. Yet the profits never trickled down. The financial windfall lined the pockets of a small elite, often of Spanish, Chinese, or mixed heritage. Meanwhile, ordinary Filipinos saw little benefit. The wealth transformed Manila into one of the great cities of the world, with a population of 90,000 by 1780, of which only 3,000 to 4,000 were Spaniards. The outside world came knocking in 1762 when a British expedition captured Manila during the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. Carr now notes, even though Britain and Spain had been at war for 9 months, the ruler of the Philippines knew nothing of the conflict until, to his astonishment, he saw a fleet of 15 British ships sailing into Manila Bay. The easy British victory underlined both Spain's disregard for its faraway dominion and the fragility of its colonial administration. Lacking precious minerals, prized spices, or strategic military value, the British withdrew at the war's conclusion. But not before confiscating every Spanish ship in the harbor, annihilating the city's economy. This eye-opening experience made many Filipinos realize that far from guiding the colony towards progress, the Spanish had surrendered it in time. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment had arrived in Europe, and Charles III of Spain sought to spread its ideas of rational governance and economic reform across the empire. In Manila, groups like the Economic Society of the Friends of the Country emerged. with the stated mission of reviving the Philippine economy through science and planning. It didn't go well. The society first advocated converting productive farmland to tobacco, the world's leading cash crop at the time. Almost immediately, food shortages spread throughout the islands. They tried sugar necks, which tapped into a booming international trade, enriching a few elites at the expense of workers who labored under near-slavery conditions. Astonishingly, the Philippines, once agriculturally self-sufficient, was suddenly forced to import rice. The profits from sugar were so immense that these trade-offs were made with little regard for the public's well-being. Hoping to maximize returns, the Spanish crown allowed foreign investors to enter the market beginning in 1864. 25 European venture capitalists quickly seized the opportunity to build modern sugar mills. These new operations drove local mills out of business and laid the foundation for new elite business empires. Empires that still exert outsized influence in the Philippines today. The results were dramatic. Carnal writes, over the next 3 decades, the island's sugar exports multiplied 600 times and its population increased tenfold. But with rapid industrial growth came new problems, most notably the seeds of rebellion. Despite their fervent Catholic faith, Filipinos were denied the right to become priests. Spain had learned from rebellions in Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere that indigenous clergy often played central roles in uprisings. To avoid that risk, they blocked Filipinos from the priesthood. This policy dates back to 1725, when an Augustinian bishop declared, "The native who seeks priesthood does so not because he has a call to a more perfect state of life, but because of the great and infinite advantages that accrue to him. What a difference between paying tribute and being paid a stipend, between being drafted to cut timber and being waited on hand and foot, between rowing a galley and being conveyed in one. What reverence will the Indios themselves show towards him when he is of their color and race, especially when they realize that they are perhaps the equals or better of one who managed to get himself ordained, when his proper station should be that of a convict or a slave?" More than a century later, Jose Burgos, a Spaniard by heritage, denounced the friars on the eve of his ordination. He shamed them for portraying Filipinos as intellectually unfit for the priesthood, declaring that if the people were indeed unworthy, it was because the friars had failed to educate them, choosing instead to keep them in ignorance to deny them prosperity and dignity. A movement began to swell across the islands. Initially directed at the monastic orders, the call for reform soon shifted towards a cry for independence. In earlier centuries, Spain might have ignored unrest within such a remote colony. But now, with most of its American territories lost, the Philippines and its sugar industry had become one of Spain's last profitable holdings. Alarmed, Spain sent a hardline general to suppress the growing resistance. Ironically, this general was swayed by the very rebels he had been sent to crush. He toasted them, proclaiming, "The Philippines for the Filipinos." He was swiftly replaced by another general who promised to rule with the sword and the cross. Burgos was soon arrested under fabricated charges of conspiring with the United States to expel Spain from the islands. A military tribunal found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death by garrote. 2 other priests joined him in public execution. Their deaths, as martyrs, sparked a flame that would not be extinguished. As historian Nick Joquin writes, their deaths marked the beginning of a nationalist consciousness. Jose Rizal invoked the martyred priests in his own revolutionary stand against Spanish rule. Power imbalances are difficult to resolve, especially when they've been systematically entrenched over generations. They become nearly impossible to undo when ethnicity or skin color is used as part of the justification for inequality. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, two early civil rights leaders in the United States proposed very different paths forward for newly freed African Americans. Booker T. Washington believed former slaves should earn the respect of their fellow citizens by doing what they already knew how to do: domestic work and agricultural labor. He felt that working side by side with their former masters would eventually lead to equality being given. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, called for a complete break with the past. He believed that former slaves should pursue elite professions: doctors, lawyers, professors. Only by obtaining respected positions in society could they hope to win the dignity and equality they deserved. He also demanded immediate integration in all fields. Rizal aligned with Du Bois. He sought to prove that Filipinos were equal to Westerners, eschewing traditional garb in favor of European clothing and customs. He believed reform would not be driven by the masses, but by an educated elite akin to Du Bois' idea of the talented tenth. A dedicated student, Rizal attended the University of Madrid and hired private tutors to guide him through additional coursework in French, English, Italian, German, painting, fencing, shooting, and calisthenics. Carnot writes, "Above all, he observed the political scene. Power in Spain was oscillating between conservatives and liberals, and republicans, monarchists, socialists, anarchists, atheists, and clergymen, continually embroiled in boisterous debates. Exhilarated by the giddy atmosphere, Rizal pondered an obvious question: why did Spain forbid such freedom in the Philippines? He joined a group known as the Propagandists, who sought to influence both Filipino society and their Spanish rulers through the written word. In 1887, Rizal published a novel that became an instant must-read, despite its quasi-illegal status. Carnot summarizes, "The melodramatic story involves a young Filipino, clearly a fantasy of Rizal himself, who returns home from Europe to be killed after inciting the wrath of a Spanish friar. The book accurately depicts conditions in the Philippines at the time with unsparing candor. Its Spanish characters, venal priests and officials, are as reprehensible as the ignorant, servile, and corrupt natives. Its message is simple. Without reforms, a revolution will erupt, and the defenseless and innocent will suffer the most." Rizal's sequel described the situation in even bleaker terms, leading the colonial government to banish him to the remote town of Dapitan on the island of Mindanao. But his downfall wasn't the end of his story. There, he opened a school for children, built a clinic, and taught locals modern techniques to improve their lives. Rather than sulk, he improved his corner of the world. He may have been too selfless. When the government put out a call for doctors to help combat a yellow fever outbreak in Cuba, Rizal volunteered. Though the junta's general approved his offer, influential friars intervened and had him arrested en route. The charge was aiding and abetting a rebellion. The sentence was death. But Rizal was a reformer, not a rebel. While revolutionary leaders had indeed reached out to the propagandists, surviving evidence shows that Rizal turned them all down. The rebellion in question was led by Andres Bonifacio, whose life stood in sharp contrast to that of the elite Rizal. Bonifacio grew up in the slums of Manila and abandoned school to help support his family. Like Rizal, he believed education was one of the few keys to a better life in the Philippines, the others being generational wealth or being born a Spaniard. He read the works of Rizal, legal texts, and biographies of American presidents, men who had taken on an empire and triumphed. Rather than targeting religion, Bonifacio tried to co-opt it. He visited a mythical Tagalong savior whose ghost was said to haunt a cave, and from there he launched his revolution. He told his followers, "It is a waste of time to wait for promises of felicity that will never come. We can only expect suffering upon suffering, treachery upon treachery, tyranny upon tyranny." Inspired in part by Rizal's novel, Bonifacio hoped the author would connect him with wealthy elites who shared their vision. But the elites warned that the timing wasn't right. Ignoring them, Bonifacio stole weapons from Spanish arsenals and moved ahead. The colonial government took the threat seriously. The governor reinforced his army, proof that Bonifacio's rebellion was feared. Spain, already bogged down by a rebellion in Cuba, was vulnerable. With tensions rising, authorities began arresting all suspected dissidents, including Rizal, whose connection to the actual rebellion was tenuous at best, but whose heart no doubt supported the cause. The revolution began in August, but it was already too late for Rizal. He was forced to stand with his back to the firing squad, a position reserved for traitors. At just 35 years old, he joined the long list of martyrs who had dared to fight for the freedom of their people. Bonifacio first tried to bring the Filipino elites to his cause by asking for their help. When that failed, he resorted to forging their names on lists of his soldiers. By leaking these lists, he gave the elites a simple choice: join him for real or face the firing squads of the police. Carnau notes that the Spanish police, underpaid lower-class expatriates, had long resented the upper-class Filipinos and took a perverse satisfaction in arresting, humiliating, and even killing them. Unfortunately for Bonifacio, he was a poor military leader, while his lieutenant, Emilio Aguinaldo, proved to be exceptional. Aguinaldo quickly emerged as a national leader, holding his home province despite commanding mostly peasants armed with knives, staves, and homemade rifles. His territory soon expanded to 3 towns, and he cleverly ambushed large columns of Spanish soldiers. Superstition helped build his reputation. One notable sign from heaven involved a retreating Spanish commander whose inscription included the year of Aguinaldo's birth. To a deeply superstitious people, this, combined with Aguinaldo's string of victories, was enough to inspire devotion. In October, Aguinaldo announced plans to create a government modeled after the United States, one that lived up to the French Revolution's cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Spanish panicked. They replaced the colonial governor with yet another hardliner who ordered his troops to wash all offenses in blood. War is brutal business. To kill sanctioned enemies, soldiers often resort to dehumanizing their foes. For many, racist jabs are mere bravado to boost morale, but sometimes this dehumanization spills over into atrocities. One Spanish officer welcoming a new regiment toasted, "The cannibals are still in the forest. The wild beasts are hiding in their lairs. The hour has come to exterminate the savages. Destroy, kill, show no mercy." The new governor, fresh from fighting rebels in Cuba, immediately cleared the prisons by hastily conducting show trials. When that proved too slow, he simply had prisoners shot in their cells. After assessing the situation, the governor presented Queen Isabella with 2 options: escalate the war or negotiate peace. He calculated that pacifying the Philippines would require 45,000 additional soldiers, an impossibility given Spain's ongoing rebellion in Cuba. The Queen refused negotiation, ordering him to continue the conflict without reinforcements. Despite his concerns, the governor followed orders and slowly pushed forward against Bonifacio's rebels. It's critically important to finish the job you're on before moving to the next step of the master plan. Sensing an imminent collapse of the Spaniards, the Filipinos began to position themselves to be the one who would benefit the most. Both Aguinaldo and Bonifacio planned rival regimes. The originator of the conflict, Bonifacio, struck first, maliciously ceding several areas under his control to the Spanish, leading to the death of Aguinaldo's brother. The younger, more successful Aguinaldo then turned on Bonifacio, convening a kangaroo court that quickly sentenced him to death. Bonifacio, the very man who had started the revolution, was carried by hammock into a forest clearing, shot, and left for dead. Aguinaldo had begun to believe his own propaganda. His split with Bonifacio fractured the Filipino forces and gave Spain the upper hand. Undeterred, Aguinaldo led his troops, along with their families and cattle, over 1,000 men, women, and children, through the jungle, evading the tightening Spanish noose. They settled in an old iron mine and began negotiating. His first peace offer was to accept Spanish rule if all friars were expelled from the island. The Spanish rejected this. In response, Aguinaldo declared an independent state with himself as executive. More than 5,000 rallied to his cause, swelling the iron mine community, but also increasing the risk of disease. Eventually, negotiations broke the deadlock, but Aguinaldo compromised. He accepted 800,000 pesos in exchange for rebels laying down their arms. The deal included his exile to Hong Kong. The colonial government congratulated itself on ending the rebellion so easily. They had, in Carnot's words, decapitated the rebellion and banished its leader without committing to any real reforms. But they didn't fully comprehend Aguinaldo's plan, as he intended to use the Spanish blood money to buy real weapons in return for vengeance. Like Jesus, he would rise 3 days later to claim victory over his enemies. But real-life politics rarely follow as neat of a script. Aguinaldo met with Ronsown Wildman, the American consul, at a time when tensions between the U.S. and Spain were at a breaking point over Cuba's future as a potential slave state. Aguinaldo proposed an alliance between their peoples, united against the Spaniards. They shook hands on a deal. Aguinaldo would purchase 20,000 guns and 200,000 rounds of ammunition on credit from the U.S. In exchange, he would cede 2 Philippine provinces to America, a nation at that time that had no colonial holdings. The combination of American weapons and Aguinaldo's skill and popularity could have secured Philippine independence. Unfortunately, the U.S. State Department rejected the deal. Turns out there was a secret plan underway, one that would give the United States far more than just 2 provinces. The Americans were coming to the Philippines, and no one would be able to stop them. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every little bit helps. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.